Hello and welcome to the Intentional Brief, your weekly video update on the one big thing in cybersecurity news for growth stage companies, investors, and their management teams. I'm your host, Shay Colson, managing partner at Intentional Cybersecurity, and you can find us online at intentionalcyber.com. Today is Monday, September 16th, 2024, Fall is quickly arriving, so if you've got things you want to do that don't involve being in front of a screen and do need decent weather, probably should get those on the calendar. I am mostly talking to myself on that one. There's been a good bit of news in the past week about the very real impact of teenage criminals, leading to this week's discussion that the kids are not all right. In particular, I'm talking about an attack out of the UK on Transport for London, also known as TfL, who are in the midst of clearing up quite a bit of carnage after a pretty disruptive attack, the details of which we'll get to in a moment. But after suffering this attack last week, the National Crime Agency in the UK has announced the arrest of a 17-year-old in relation to the attack, which took place starting on September 1st. They are now more than 2 weeks in. And this attack took down their infrastructure for multiple days and is being attributed generally to the same group that we saw attack MGM and Caesars casinos in Las Vegas of Scattered Spider, also known as Lapsus. So while TfL, or Transport for London, has been able to literally keep the trains running, probably due in no small part to some network segmentation, one imagines, they have recently adjusted their public stance that no customer data was impacted, making an update to their status page where it changed the line that previously said there is no evidence that any customer data has been compromised, which has now been replaced with the security of our systems and customer data is very important to us, because of course it is. They have also updated some of their employee-based pages to note that we're contacting customers directly about the steps being taken regarding their data. Still a little bit in the dark around that, and that's probably because they're busy resetting the entire infrastructure's worth of accounts. So in response to their attack, Transport for London locked and reset all 30,000 of their accounts and is now in the midst of resetting each of them manually by having employees come into the office physically around the city to reset and re-enroll their devices. This is a massive undertaking, and they're providing new updates to employees by a WordPress site that they've stood up since the attack took place, and noting that their frontline managers and people leaders will be starting WhatsApp groups to communicate to employees on next steps. So I'm not passing judgment on them for the communications channels that they're using or for taking this approach. In fact, I'm actually pretty impressed that they're willing to undertake such a burdensome process in the name of security. And I think that if we're honest with ourselves, most of our organizations wouldn't take that step. We wouldn't make employees come into the office. So because we're probably unwilling to do that, we need to instead focus on preventing this attack from being successful. So as a reminder, the main advantage as an attacker that Scattered Spider has is the fact that they're digital natives and native English speakers, and they simply call up the help desk, pretend they've lost their phone, and need an MFA reset re-enrollment. So this means you've got to have a playbook in your set of defenses for this attack, which is known as MFA stripping, to ensure that you aren't literally giving the attackers access. This pattern aligns, in fact, with the findings that were released last week by CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency here in the US, whose analysis of their FY 2023 risk and vulnerability assessment showed that successful attack rates were dominated by simply using valid accounts to gain access. They showed a success rate in their data set at over 41%. Number two was a closely related attack, phishing, at a success rate of over 26%, wherein your employees actually give up the credentials by clicking on the link and submitting their credentials by trying to log in. So while defending against this threat may mean taking the hard stance of asking or requiring employees to come into the office to re-enroll an MFA device like a lost phone, it also means empowering your help desk to be able to be willing to push back on employees who call legitimately with a lost device and are feeling embarrassed or frustrated or can't be productive or can't get their email or are missing an important meeting or whatever else. And do not want to hear that they are going to now have to come into an office to reset their account, or whatever hoops they may have to jump through based on your own refresh of your playbook. But imagine the cost of this to the enterprise is far greater than the cost to the employee. Asking employees on a one-off basis to come into the office when they lost their device is far preferable to having to ask all employees to come into the office all in a single week to reset all of their devices. This just seems like a prudent control to me. And it's not just Transport for London. In the same week, we also saw news out of the Netherlands that a 19-year-old has been arrested for a widespread and highly successful phishing campaign, his fourth such arrest. Reporter Brian Krebs has a deeply researched piece on his site this week about the nexus between disaffected young men online and these so-called harm groups that are having real-world consequences. This is a bit of a heavy read, so fair warning to you, but the article explores, quote, how many of these young Western cyber criminals are also members of fast-growing online groups that exist solely to bully, stalk, harass, and extort vulnerable teens into physically harming themselves and others. So while this is not obviously a purely cybersecurity issue, the nexus between threats, attacks, and real-world harm rings true for me. That's a space I like to be able to make a difference in. Plus, being a parent of kids who are growing up in this digital age, it makes this an issue that is just harder and harder to ignore. So once you finish updating your MFA playbooks, go and give your kids a hug. And maybe their friends too. From a fundraising perspective, we're back to the big leagues with our numbers. More than $27.5 billion in newly committed capital this week, led by ICG, who raised $17 billion for its fifth European direct lending fund, the largest of its kind ever to close in the region. We also saw Bain Capital Life Sciences throw in about $3 billion or so for their fourth fund, and a host of billion-dollar-ish commitments driving this big week for dry powder. Also of note in this space was a good but less positive article from the Financial Times about VC activity in China, which laid out a thesis about why, quote, in 2018, at the height of VC investment, 51,302 startups were founded in China. By 2023, that figure had collapsed to 1,202 and is on track to be even lower this year. The FT article boils it all down to a couple of things, including involvement by the state, which makes up reportedly 80% of the capital allocated in this space, but also directing investment to or away from industries that align with Xi's vision for economic prosperity in China moving forward, notably moving away from biotech, consumer technology, and education, and moving towards energy, integrated circuits, and new materials. So macroeconomic nerds, this story is for you. With that, a reminder that you can find all of the articles that we talked about in the comments section below. You can find links to these videos and written transcripts in the archive at intentionalcyber.com, and we will see you next week for another edition of the Intentional Brief.